Alex with Kodiak Woodcraft. In this video, we're going to be building a cutting board. If you are a newer woodworker, or even if you've been at it for a while, this is a great project to really hone your skills. I have built several of these over the years, and I've got a few of them right here. All of these have a sort of a symmetrical vibe going on, but that's not absolutely necessary. You can use your creativity and build these any way you'd like. You might choose to build your board out of a single slab of wood, or maybe you want to glue up some strips like I've done with these. Even better, maybe you want to take it one step farther and build an end grain cutting board by creating the glue up like this, cutting it, and then doubling it back upon itself. You have so many different options. A word about wood selection. It's pretty important. There are 3 classic domestic hardwoods that you'll see used frequently in cutting boards, and they are maple, walnut, and cherry. You can also venture out beyond these. Personally, I love to use Peruvian walnut, and I've even done some beech boards like the one you see here. I will say not every wood is cut out to be a cutting board. I'll give you one example of a wood that isn't, and that is oak. Oak may be a hardwood, but it has very large pores, and there's some contamination concerns with the large pores. What you want to find is a hardwood with a small, tight grain pattern, just to keep your cutting board as safe as possible for use in the kitchen. Anyway, let's get to building, and then at the end of the video, we'll circle back for some maintenance tips.
All right, I just told you that I'm a fan of Peruvian walnut, and that is for several reasons. Not only is it really easy to work with, but it's also typically darker than your classic American black walnut. I love the way it looks with some nice curly maple. It's just one of my all-time favorite combinations. The maple board that I had used for this project was already fully surfaced, but the Peruvian walnut was not. I had to address that, so I kicked off this project at the planer. I ran all of my rough stock through the unit, taking off just a thin layer with each pass. My planer is set up pretty well, but I was still careful to lift up and support the boards as they entered and exited the cutter heads in order to reduce any potential snipe that might result from sagging stock. I wanted to be able to glue these boards up right off the planer, and as you'll see in a moment, I was able to do so. In case you're wondering, I'm not going to use all of the material that you're seeing here for the cutting board. I'm just not going to need quite this much, but I wanted to get it all planed at once so that I could use the rest for a future project. Once I had all of my stock surfaced, it was time to cut the strips to the length of the cutting board. For this build, I wasn't targeting any precise dimensions, so I optimized for the largest board possible and cut each board down into thirds. If you're going to take a similar approach, I'd recommend starting with your shortest board and dividing from there. With that said, this really isn't the time for absolute precision. We'll be cutting the board down to its final length after we glue these up. They just have to be pretty close. The next part of the milling process was to cut the material into strips. I wanted to build a thick board, so I ripped each piece of stock right down the middle and ended up getting 2 strips from each piece. With these rip cuts, precision was pretty important. The more consistent the strips in height, the less work I would have to do to flatten the soon-to-be glued-up slab. Consistency here would also make it easier to stabilize the material when it came time to surface it. As you can see, by the end of the milling stage, all of my strips were pretty much the same dimensions. Also, if you're counting, I did end up ditching one of the strips that you see in this shot. If you're following along here, I wanted to take 10 seconds to thank you for watching and let you know that you're appreciated. If you find the video helpful, I'd like to ask for your subscription. It really does help me grow the channel. I'd also appreciate if you drop a comment and let me know what you think of the video. I'll take your feedback into account when I make the next one. The next stage of the cutting board was the glue up. As I like to do, I recycled an old paint roller and rolled a generous amount of wood glue onto each strip. I used Titebond 3, it's waterproof and it's great for cutting boards. After all the strips had glue applied, I assembled the board and the clamps. One thing I wanted to mention is that I actually would not recommend using plastic wrap to shield your clamps, as you're seeing me do here. The reason is it would be too easy to accidentally pinch the plastic into your glue up. Fortunately, I was able to avoid any problems with that, but in hindsight, it's not something I would recommend. Anyway, I concluded the glue up phase by clamping the daylights out of the board, and I let it sit until the next day. Once I had my glue up done, it was time for surfacing. There are lots of ways to do this part. One option would be to use a hand plane. Another option would have been to glue temporary long runners onto the side of each board so that the whole thing could be sent through the planer again. Finally, we have option number 3, which I always gravitate to and I also kind of hate. I'm using my router jig to flatten the board. You may have seen this in a previous video. This is the same technique that I used to flatten my Lazy Susan. I'll let you check that one out if you want to see more of this jig. At some point, I'm going to end up getting a CNC, but until then, I'll keep doing this and getting absolutely covered in dust. Now, I will say, even though it's not my favorite, this jig really does work for me. These boards end up absolutely dead flat, and the milling marks are really easy to remove. It's probably worth it in the end. Anyway, after I flattened the first side, I went ahead and did some quick rough sanding, and then I flipped it over and did the other side. The next step in the project was to trim the board down to its final length. I did end up having to cut off a bit more stock than I would have liked in order to minimize some cavities in the wood. I could have filled them in with epoxy as they were just on the end, but that just wasn't in the cards for this build. After I was satisfied with the crosscuts, I went ahead and carefully trimmed the sides of the board just to make sure that they were clean and square. At this point, this was starting to look like a cutting board. I broke out my router and put a nice chamfer on the edges of the board. The key here was to make a couple of passes, increasing the depth of cut with each. If 45-degree angles aren't your thing, round over profiles also work great. Once my edges were done, I had to fill in a few small remnants of the wood cavities I was telling you about a moment ago. They were small enough to fill in with sawdust. I collected some fine Peruvian walnut dust, mixed it up with Titebond, and then completely filled in the gaps. I then sanded, temporarily without a dust collector hose, and allowed the process to completely fill in the gaps. This worked exactly as intended. I was then able to move on to the full-blown sanding process. I'll stick to my tradition of breezing over the sanding phases of the project in this video. The main thing to know is that I worked through a variety of grits, ultimately arriving at 220 grit sandpaper. In the past, with other boards, I've gone further and you may choose to do so. I intend for this board to see plenty of use, so there's probably a diminishing return when it comes to going any further than 220. At this point, the board was ready for an application of mineral oil. It's always an exciting moment. I may have been a little too excited, or maybe it was a little too late in the evening, because what you're about to see is one of the sloppier applications I've done. Let's just say I had a little bit of cleanup to do after this one. Even so, no harm. It all worked out great for the board, and I ended up doing 2 applications about 24 hours apart, wiping off the excess oil at the end.
Alright, that concludes the build process. You've built your board, and now you need to take care of it. The first thing to know is that your board should really be conditioned in order to make sure that it doesn't dry out and potentially crack. The best way to do this is with using a food-safe oil. Earlier in the video, you saw that I used mineral oil. I used the basic stuff straight from the drugstore, and this was intentional because mineral oil does not go rancid. You should know that most oil presented and sold as cutting board oil is mostly just mineral oil. So I would recommend against buying a dedicated commercial off-the-shelf product that's labeled as such. I would just stick with the basic ingredient. If you want to get fancy, you can choose to add beeswax into the equation. It thickens up the oil a little bit and it smells nice and it's just as food safe. Now, let's talk about meat. Some people avoid using their wooden cutting boards for meat. I'm not going to tell you how to live your life. This is not a major issue for me, but it's something to be aware of. Next up, cleaning your board. My main advice is just to do it by hand. Don't be afraid to use soapy warm water or even a little bit of white vinegar. That's all fine. What you want to avoid is submerging your board or leaving it wet, or definitely not putting it in the dishwasher. That's a really good way to destroy all of your hard work. Over time, if you're lucky, your cutting board will start to show wear. It'll have knife marks in it. It'll be a sign of a board well loved. Know that you can always fix up and or restore your board. Whether that's some light sanding to remove blemishes or even a complete resurfacing, you can always go back to the wood shop and make your board just like new again, using the same techniques that you used to build it in the first place. That's one of the best benefits of doing this yourself. Please make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so that you don't miss my next video. Thanks for watching.